Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, and we'll look there in just a few moments. It is so good to be with you and to be with the ones that Gene said are family, and then the rest of you are too. It is so good to be in a place that feels so at home. We feel at home where we live now. We've made our home there in many ways, and my family has all ended up in that general area for the most part, our immediate family, and so it feels all the more home for that reason. But we still think very fondly and especially of Pleasant Grove, and we always love to come back here. Philip called and after he had scheduled the meeting, he called back and said, I told you could pick your topic, but I'd like to change that and pick it for you. And I said, well, that's all right. And so he said he wanted me to preach on biblical morality. And the definition for that is just basically what's right and wrong. I said, well, that 40 minutes ought to take care of that. But he didn't just say that. He began to list out different angles he'd like me to cover. And so I don't think I could cover the entirety of the topic, and I'm not sure I can get to everything Philip was thinking about, but I hope we can get to some important elements and say some of the things that we need to about this subject. And I think not just from the standpoint of the Sermon on the Mount as we see morality being discussed here, but just on the landscape of the culture that we're in. It is an increasingly important thing for Christians to have a grasp on where morality comes from. I've heard all my life, you can't legislate morality. Well, I think an amendment to that ought to be, I understand what people mean by that. There's limits to what you can legislate, maybe in a democratic society. But the bottom line is, every legislation is morality. And the question is not whether we will legislate morality, but whose morality. And I think that's where we got to come to grips, is what's the ruler, as Wes was talking about last night. Whose ruler are we going to use to decide what is right and what is wrong? I remember several years ago, I came up to Birmingham when we were living in Montgomery, and I came up for a debate between an atheist and a Catholic. It turned out to be a different Catholic than I thought I was coming to hear, and it was John Lennox ended up being the substitute. He was debating the late Christopher Hitchens. And after the debate, it was disappointing. John Lennox didn't say the things I thought he should have said. And I was talking to Wes after the debate, and I said, what did you think about that? And he said, a fellow like that, Christopher Hitchens, gets up there and he starts talking about right and wrong. And he said, I think I'd just say to him, you don't get to use those words. They're not yours. You don't know where they come from. And unless you define them and tell me where you get them from, I know where my right and wrong comes from. But Hitchens didn't. And the world is out there talking all day about right and wrong, and they don't even know what the words mean. And I think we ought to call them on it. And, of course, God's Word is the tool that we must use to call them on it. So we're going to be looking at that this evening. I hope to accomplish, to some degree, two particular aims this evening. And one is to equip us to answer the critic of biblical morality, who is all around us, of course. And then the other is to make sure we don't fall into a trap, I think, of being unwittingly critical of biblical morality ourselves. And I think that's a very easy thing to do in our modern minds. I was reading a book just the other day by a fellow named Josh McDowell, who I think has written some very helpful material on apologetics and so forth. And he was talking about tolerance, and I thought he would do a pretty good job with that. So I was reading through that, and he made the mistake I hear so many make over and over again of falling into that trap of sort of setting out the moral landscape as if society, human society, is on this long train of continual progression, including moral progress. I'm going to tell you what, humans have never been on a consistent path of moral progress. It is almost always the other direction. And the morals that were set out have been set out from God, who was at the beginning. And if we're going to find the answers, this is the thing. We always think in our modern minds, the answers are always forward. We're going to figure it out. When it comes to morality, especially, the answers are always backwards. They're in the other direction. They were revealed by God, and they're not going to be revealed differently in the future. So we turn backwards. We turn 2,000 years to begin with backwards. And in Matthew chapter 5, we look at some things that Jesus had to say here, and we begin to make the first point that I want to suggest to you, and that is that we need to wrap our heads around how to think about the way God lays out morality. In Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 20, Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 20, we're sort of picking up where Brother Brown left off last night, Jesus talking about the annulment of the least of these commandments. He says in verse 20, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, I think that is right on the heels of what he's talking about destroying and annulling. And I think that the way that they had handled God's law had in so many ways done just that. That they had set aside God's commands, that they had annulled God's commands. And we can see that in various other places as Jesus illustrates that in summary ways. But beginning in verse 21, he says, "You have heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." And he goes on to show that it is insufficient to think in ways about that command that stop right there at the surface. If you think that taking that command and thinking only in terms of as long as I don't kill anyone, I'll be all right. He says that's not enough. That's not the way God wants you to think about that. That's the way the Pharisee might think about that, but it's not the way we ought to think about that. And so he goes on, he says, "I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponents at law while you're with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." So that's far more expansive. That's covering a lot of territory on a few words. You shall not murder. Paul, I think, alludes to this kind of thought process over in Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, and beginning there in verse 8, Paul says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." Now notice this. He says, "For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." So what Paul indicates is that all of these negative commands, do no harm, right? That's in the negative. Don't do this. Should indicate, the thought process ought to be that should point you in the other direction, so that the conclusion of these negative commands is an affirmative. You ought to love your neighbor, right? You ought to do the very opposite of what I'm telling you not to do. You ought to be turning the other direction and treating him in the very opposite ways. You ought to avoid harm, and by avoiding harm, that ought to lead you in this direction. I think of the Hippocratic Oath with doctors, right? First, do no harm. And that's the only part of the Hippocratic Oath I know, incidentally. But I gather that the indication is that that's just a starting point. The idea is that, of course, a doctor actually wants to make things better. But how do you get to making things better? Well, you start by not making them worse. Well, you start there. And we don't want a doctor who ends there, do we? That says, well, I'm not going to do you any harm. Okay, but I came to you to actually do me some good. So I'd like you to go well the other direction of where the Hippocratic Oath tells you not to go. And I think in the same way, God says, don't go here. Well, the idea is that they ought to, and of course, God didn't leave it there, and that's not all that he said about that. He gave them enough other information to add that together, including, of course, the command to love their neighbor in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. So he gave them the path to get over there, but what Paul does is he puts that together even with just those few words. My parents taught me in the same ways, right? So my mother would say something similar to that. She might leave us at home. She goes, I don't want anybody to kill anybody else. Right? I'm leaving. I want everybody to be alive, do no harm. And what does she really want? She wants us to love each other. But now she'd settle to start with for no murder. And then she'd like us to come along a little bit farther along the way. So God teaches us like that. And I tell you, as we begin to try to develop our thought processes, as we're reading the Old Testament, where some foundations of morality, in fact, the foundations of morality are laid there in the Old Testament, we're thinking through that. We need to be careful that we don't end up reading that the same way a Pharisee would. If we read the law, and in our minds we have a picture of the law that is like the Pharisees, then woe is us, because the mystery's been revealed. And in fact, the mystery of Jesus Christ himself, who is the fulfillment of the law, and one of the many ways he fulfills the law is, in fact, by doing it. So that when you want a picture of what perfect law keeping looks like, I've asked high school classes sometimes, what does it look like for people to carefully keep all of the law? And some of them will say, that's what a Pharisee did. No, they made a wreck of it. Perfect law keeper is Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful picture that we have in the law. And it is God in the flesh when it is kept perfectly. That's what it looks like. And so we need to think more deeply than the Pharisees. And that's, of course, what Jesus is telling us, to think more deeply than they did. Now, when we think about those rules and thinking more deeply about those rules, some people think that thinking deeply about the rules means that you can figure out a way around them. And of course, that's nonsense. Thinking deeply about the rules should bring you to a greater and more full keeping of those rules, certainly not an avoidance. We're not looking for loopholes. Matthew chapter 23, when Jesus is near the end of his life and he is making his sort of final assault on the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and you're familiar with this chapter, the many woes that he pronounces to the scribes and Pharisees. Verse 23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." I was preaching in a gospel meeting one time and had been asked to deal with this particular passage. And I just made the point that, that when we are looking at the two illustrations here, the gnat and the camels, that obviously there's an absurdity to somebody picking out gnats and leaving the hunk of camel right there and swallowing that while being particular about these much smaller elements. And I said, but once we get the camel out of there, I still would like the gnats out of there. I don't like to eat gnat soup. And this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I never considered that. I thought Jesus was saying the gnats don't matter. And I said, well, do they not matter to you? She goes, no, I don't want gnats in my soup either. I said, so I think what people come away with here is that Jesus is minimizing somehow the tithing of the mint and the dill and the cumin. It's the same as when God says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Do you think after all that God said about sacrifice that what he really means is I don't care if anybody ever sacrifices to me? Well, what he means is I don't want empty sacrifice. And I don't want your empty tithing. I want it to mean something when you do it. But the tithing is important. Every command that God gave was instructive and was supposed to lead them closer and closer to him. And that they didn't, and when they didn't, is the fault of the people, not of the one who gave the instructions. So sometimes we may be trying to teach morality to our children, and when they're very small, we do much the same thing. We teach them very simple rules. Yes and no rules. We don't teach them. They don't have the capacity to understand justice and mercy and faithfulness. They can understand this: don't hit your sister. So we start there. And as we go along, we build on that. We put that together and talk about reasons why we don't do that. And we bring them all along more and more. I think God's law works very much the same way. He starts out in Exodus chapter 20, and he gives us a real simple list of things to do. And I think even there, maybe we don't appreciate the depth. You know, we've already talked about the depth of, like, do not murder. But even something like the Sabbath day. As you come down to the Sabbath and you wonder about its importance, and for us very often it's the one we set to the side, obviously, because we don't continue to keep the Sabbath under the new covenant. And so we say, you know, the 9 of those 10 commandments have the repetitious theme, at least in the New Testament. Some are repeated explicitly, but the Sabbath, we just set it to the side. But understand, the Sabbath was teaching something fundamental. It wasn't just a peculiar thing to ask the people to see if they would do it. In Jeremiah, this is one of the most peculiar passages in Jeremiah to me. I've been reading through Jeremiah a lot lately. I'm going to be teaching it soon at Pepper Road. And so I came across this passage again recently, brought it to mind. It says in Jeremiah 17 and verse 24, it says, "But it will come about if you listen attentively to me, declares the Lord, to bring no load in through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but to keep the Sabbath day holy by doing no work on it. Then there will come in through the gates of this city kings and princes sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this city will be inhabited forever. And they will come in from the cities of Judah and from the environs of Jerusalem and the land of Benjamin, from the lowland, from the hill country, and from the Negev, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices and grain offerings and incense, and bringing sacrifices of thanksgiving to the house of the Lord. But if you do not listen to me to keep the Sabbath day holy, by not carrying a load, and coming in through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it will devour the palaces of Jerusalem and will not be quenched." Jeremiah is one of the most blistering prophets from the standpoint of his message is almost, there's just not many bright spots. He is the prophet that God tells repeatedly, stop even asking. I am so done. I'm going to wipe them out, and there's just no way out of it. And so, in the midst of him condemning Israel and saying it's coming and there's nothing you could do, to stop and say, if you just keep the Sabbath, I think we could turn it around. Now, I don't know about you, but I think, we got bigger problems than the Sabbath. We do. But in another way, we don't. Because the Sabbath, at a very small level, says this: I want you to stop what you're doing. Stop everything you're doing. And you're not going to make any money today. And you're going to fall behind on your work. And it'll be all right. You set it all down. You trust me. And give me that day. And I will bless you. And so there's a fundamental element of trust in that one command that Jeremiah can hang his hat on and say, if you just do this, I think we could get somewhere. People today don't want to think about morality in the small details. Amy and I talked about this back when she was teaching school. I went to school at Mortimer Jordan High School, and the principal there was named Jimmy Trotter. And he'd been the principal for 36 years at the time I was there. And if you walked in the door and your pants were sagging, then he would tie a rope around your pants. And if your hair was too long, he'd get his clippers out. And if he found out you were cutting classes, he'd get in his pickup truck and he'd go find you. Now, there's not many principals like that anymore. And if they are, they run them off. But that was this man, and he ran a tight ship. And there were no rules that didn't apply. He enforced every single one of them. And one day, a young lady was complaining in class about how strict it was to go to Mortimer Jordan. And this former Army commander was our economics teacher, and he said, "Young lady, did you have to walk through a metal detector today?" She said, "No." She said, "Were you scared when you went into the bathroom that there was going to be a fight and somebody was going to beat you up?" "No." "You see drug deals going down in the hallway?" She said, "No." He said, because he doesn't let go of the little things. Every detail he demands. And so we don't mess with the big stuff. And it's Amy teaching in a situation where they were increasingly letting the rules go. And this is not rocket science, but people have done studies on it. When you make children follow the small rules, guess what? It translates into bigger effects. And when you let the small things go, guess what? Pretty soon you let the big things go. And so that's what happens. And even among Christians, I think sometimes as we say, "Oh, look, we got bigger problems to worry about than the small things." There's not a small thing that God says. He doesn't have small rules. They all have tremendous impacts. Even the one that says, "Just stop what you're doing and give me one day." Incidentally, when he gives that rule, it's no matter what's going on, give me that day. I think sometimes Christians, even today, could learn that lesson that you could give one day to the Lord. And he's made promises to people who give him what he's asked. But anyway, coming back to that notion of the Sabbath day, what did the Pharisees do with that rule? Well, of course, they littered it up with many of their own rules till you could hardly even recognize and see clearly the rule that God had made in the first instance. And that's what happens very often is in those small rules, we don't understand why the rules are there, that we don't teach our children why the rules are there as they come along. And the Pharisees had made such a mess of it that when Jesus came and actually fulfilled the Sabbath, they did not recognize it. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus heals on the Sabbath like he does on more than one occasion. And I think he makes some allusions here. Now let me pause here for just a minute. In Exodus chapter 20, you don't have to turn back there with me, but you can look at this later. In Exodus chapter 20, the Sabbath command is given on the premise that God rested on the seventh day after creation. You're familiar with that. On the seventh day he rested, you shall rest. But in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses reiterates the Ten Commandments, he says the Sabbath is also given because God delivered you from bondage and gave you rest. All right, so those are the two things. God rested and God gave you rest. Well, in Luke chapter 13, it says he was teaching in one of the synagogues, this is verse 10, teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who for 18 years had had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. And when Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness," not healed, He says, you're freed from your sickness. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. But the synagogue official, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowds in response, there are 6 days in which work should be done. So come during them and get healed, and not on the Sabbath day. But the Lord answered him and said, you hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey, or loose his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham, as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond or bondage on the Sabbath day? And as he said this, all his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over all the glorious things being done by him. Here, they see what happens, and they say, how dare you do this on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, what? Set a woman free from bondage? Sabbath is a perfect day for that. But they didn't know it, because all they could think about was right there on the surface. And so I just want to set in place a warning to us that we do want to appreciate God's morality. We do want to appreciate his rules, and we want to appreciate them as deeply as they are given. We want to understand all that's meant by them. There are two kinds of people who I think ask for more information when they're given instruction. There's the kind of person that wants to know more because he wants to know how he can either get around it or do as little as possible. I want it precisely. You know, that's the Pharisee. Precisely, we want to, and I think maybe there's some genuine motives at some point along the way, maybe for some of those fellows. But the idea is we want it all laid out so that we can know every particular, and the worst of it is, and no more. But then there's the person who asks for more information because they really want to do what you want them to do. What is it that you want from me? Precisely because I want to please you. And part of that means you got to know the heart. And I think God has given us all that information. He's given us more information so that we can interrogate those commands further, and we can see more of what he wants from us, and not be like, on the one hand, the Pharisees who dumps more and more rules on it, or on the other hand, the person who says, define it down to the least little bit so I can either get right up next to it, or I can find some fancy language that'll let me just get right around it. No, what we want is to fully embrace the command. Say, I want to keep it, and I want to keep it fully. I want to thoroughly be saturated with its meaning. So, morality is about rules, and those rules teach us things, and we want to know both elements there. We want to think deeply. Well, the second thing that I want to suggest about God's morality is that we need to understand what direction God is coming from when he gives a command. I'll explain what I mean about that. Sometimes people see an instruction of God and they assume things that God is not saying. They assume permissions that God is not giving in those instructions. Let me give you an example. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 22, this is a favorite passage of critics. It says there, Deuteronomy 22, beginning of verse 28, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give her to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her, and he cannot divorce her all his days. Now, the first thing to note here is I think seizes her is not a great translation. Worse, even some translations will say and rapes her. I think that's a horrible translation. I think the idea here does not exclude certainly mutual interest in this case, to put it politely. But the thing that people will say about this passage is they'll look and they'll say, see, look, in God's morality, in that old-fashioned morality, what God did is he made the woman go and be the prisoner of her abuser. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, obviously. But let me suggest to you, first of all, people have, because we are so enlightened and we think women will do fine on their own and that they don't need husbands or fathers or brothers protecting them. And let me just say, that seems to be working out very well for women these days, to be on their own with no protectors. I say that in all facetiousness. They need them as much as they ever did, and in fact maybe more so. But the fact of the matter is, in this particular case, what's happened is, here's a man who has taken what is not his, and guess what? She's got no prospects anymore. And God says, you got a responsibility. And now you got to fulfill it. And you're going to take responsibility for what you did. And guess what? Not only are you going to take responsibility, if it turns out that you wish you hadn't, I don't care, she's yours. And you can never change that. Because you thought you could have for free what is not free, what comes with commitment. You thought you could have it without the commitment. And so I'm going to put an even harder burden on you because of that. Now, there's a couple of things that first of all, people don't think about it that way, that what God is doing is placing responsibility on the man. He's not placing the burden on the woman. He's actually placing the burden on the man. Now, you got to pay up to her father, because that's who you just took it from. In fact, you just took honor from that family. And then you've got to go and take responsibility for her and care for her the rest of her life. But the other element of that I think is so important is that somebody thinks because God has made provision for what you do after you have sinned, that God then condones the sin. See, God didn't mind if you slept around so long as you do the right thing afterwards. It's not at all the case. God does mind, but he's a merciful God. And so he makes a path forward for the person who's done what they ought not to do, and does make provision for the next step in the process. People have done this with 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10, where it says, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. Let me just put a period right there. She should not leave her husband. Then Paul writes, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. So he says on the bookends here, don't leave and you don't divorce her. And in the middle he says, but now look, if you have, here's what you do. And somebody says, see, he says, you can. No, he says, you don't. But the fact of the matter is that there is almost certainly somebody in Corinth who already has. And what about them? Well, I think, again, thanks be to God. He is a merciful God. And he says, I got rules for you. You don't get to just go live your life any way you please. You're going to have to remain unmarried. Or you're going to have to go back and reconcile with the one that you've already left. But what that doesn't mean, of course, is that God is saying, if I make provisions for someone who has sinned, then I am then condoning the sins. And I think people get so twisted in their minds about that. They realize that God is a merciful God, and so they start making plans for his mercy on the other side. One time I was talking to a young man, and he was planning on leaving home, and it was a very foolish thing he was about to do. And I told him it was foolish. I told him he had good parents who cared about him and would take care of him and help him. And why would you walk away from all of that? And I said, you are being the picture of the fool that Proverbs paints right now. And he said, well, if it doesn't work out, I guess I'll just have to be the prodigal son. I said, you don't get to plan to be the prodigal son. You see, you can't plan humiliation. You can't plan eating pig slop. That happens to you, and you just hope you survive it long enough to come back. He's gone. He did come back, and then he left again, because he thinks in his mind it's a game, and you can jump in and you can jump out. God does not play games. He is merciful, he is kind, and he's always showing an opportunity and a way open. But that doesn't mean you get to walk out the gate going, I know it'll be open when I get back. You don't know that. People often seize on certain instructions in the Old Testament in criticizing. They'll seize on instructions about slaves, for instance, and say, here, look at the instructions that God gave about slavery. He condoned slavery, promoted slavery. And so what do we do with that? Well, first of all, let me just say this. We don't run away from it. And that's what too many people have done. And they've made foolish remarks. They've taken very old thought processes about a God of the Old Testament versus a God of the New Testament. And somehow he just didn't have it all figured out back then, I guess. That sure is not the way. But let's look there at Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. And a for instance here. Exodus 21 and verse 20. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. Now I've got a footnote, incidentally, if you're wondering what that means. It says, he shall suffer vengeance. Maybe that's a little more helpful. You kill your slave, you're going to suffer vengeance. Guess what? Not in most societies. In Roman society, that surely wasn't the case. In Egyptian society, that surely wasn't the case. Assyrian society, Babylonian society. But among God's people, that is a human being over there made in the image of God. And you take his life, you're going to suffer. And he goes on and he says earlier it talks about the slave, and a little bit later I think it talks about if he strikes the slave, there it is in verse 26, if he strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. I guarantee you that's not what most societies are saying. You know, most societies, including our own, in the period of slavery in the United States, if you damaged, you knocked a tooth out, knocked an eye, well, you damaged your property. I hate it for you. God says you damaged a person. And they'll go free. Because you can't treat people, even your slaves, just any way you please. Now, where people will really hone in there in chapter 21 is where it says there in verse 21. So verse 20 again, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. Now that, especially modern-ish, sounds pretty awful. But let me suggest to you, it depends on the mindset you're reading that with. Is God then sort of encouraging the beating of slaves, or what is exactly happening? I think, first of all, he's saying, if you didn't kill him, then you didn't kill him. And so the survives 2 or 3 days, it sounds like, I think sometimes what we hear is, if he survives 2 or 3 days, then dies. But he doesn't say if he survives 2 or 3 days and then dies. It says if he survives 2 or 3 days. In other words, if he doesn't die, then you didn't kill him. Now, I want you to combine that with what we just read about if you knock a tooth out or an eye out. If you really do damage in other ways, then he goes free or she goes free. You don't get to just, again, you don't get to just beat them within an inch of their life. Other places show us that if they are sick and they cannot work because of the way that you've mistreated them, guess what? You're responsible for taking care of them. You put them in that spot, and you'll lose whatever productivity and that they might have brought to you, and they're your responsibility. And what we find over and over again is not God saying, boy, I hope you amass all the slaves you can and just treat them any way you can. What we find is that God's word is much more often a restraining force. It is pulling people back from what you see in the rest of the world. Here's the way the rest of the world treats their servants, not my people. And I think as you read through, if a person who was a slave in the era that Moses is writing this, had read Moses' law, I think what they would say is, if I got to be a slave, I want to be a slave right there. Maybe not. Somebody's not going to say necessarily, I want to be a slave. But if I am one, I'd rather be one there than anywhere else. And so it pulls people back from the terrible excesses, of course, that man is so guilty of in so many places. Well, there, right in that same text, we have the passage that maybe we have some more familiarity with, when he talks about people who are in a struggle with one another. And it is just one of the places where this penalty comes up. In verse 24, the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth, the hand for the hand, the foot for the foot, the burn for the burn, the wound for wound, bruise for bruise. What do we think about that? Well, of course, over in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38, Jesus quotes that particular punishment. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever forces you to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. I think some people read that and they think what Jesus is saying is, well, that was all right back then, but we know better now. Jesus doesn't know better. He hadn't learned better than what God thought in the Old Testament. It's not, oh, that used to work, but it doesn't work now. I see a quote from time to time, and it gets posted on social media, and I see Christians post it. Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And I think people think that sounds so good. I think they think that's almost like something Jesus would say. Gandhi was a pagan reprobate and a hypocrite to boot. And I don't want to ever take something Gandhi said about God's law disparagingly and suppose that he knew better than God for his people. When God said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I need to wrap my head around why that's a good rule, because it's his rule. Now what I want to suggest to you is Jesus deals with that. Is there's a thought process about when God gives that kind of instruction, that here is what is appropriate and proper for justice, is that the Pharisee might look at that and think, I get to take whatever gets taken from me. I have the right. And he thinks of it in those kinds of terms, that I'm going to get what's mine. Think of it another possible way. When people get into disputes, when people get into fistfights, and one person hits the other person, is it usually our response that we think, I'm going to hit you with exactly the same force and exactly the same way that you hit me, and then I'll stop? No, that's not the way it works. As the old movie quote says, if they put one of ours in the hospital, we'll put one of theirs in the morgue. That's the way human interactions generally work out. Human conflicts generally work out. And God said, I will not have it. There will be justice, but it will stop here. Somebody takes your eye, you can take their eye, but you don't get to take two. Somebody steals from you, takes in violence from you, you can receive back what has been taken, but we are not going to have an ever-escalating war. And Jesus goes one step further and says, there's another option entirely. When the Roman soldier comes up to you and he slaps you in the face, and guess what? You're not a Roman citizen. You can't do anything. And so you've got your eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, slap him in the face. And that'll be the last thing you do. Here's another option. You could look at him and say, you know what? Here's my other one. I just think about that. I think about that from the standpoint of, yes, there is a need for justice, and there is a need for us to put restraints on our efforts to grab justice. But here is Jesus saying there's another possibility that you can say to the person who insults you by slapping you on the cheek, what has he really done? What has he taken from you? Somebody slaps you, what have they done to you? They've embarrassed you. They've taken your pride. Man, I wanted to get rid of that anyway. Here's another chance. Somebody says, you walk with me a mile, and you don't have a choice about it. Man, my whole goal is to be a servant. Could I go with you too? And here's the person who thinks he owns you. And what you're showing him is the person who submits like that can't be owned. Because he loves God and serves him more than he serves the thoughts of man. So God is not encouraging people, go get everything that gets took from you, but he's telling them, I believe he's restraining and holding people back from the worst excesses, from taking more and looking for more than justice demands. I also think that there's a difference between permission and encouragement. Along the same lines. In Matthew chapter 19, of course, Jesus, and the question from the Pharisees, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he said to them, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man shall not leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What God therefore has joined together, let no man separate. That's the answer. Now the qualification is, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And so we have the additional element here of a single exception to the rule. The rule is, don't divorce. Don't do it. When somebody comes to me and they've got marital problems, and maybe those marital problems do include unfaithfulness in a sexual way, my hope is that we could even repair that. God doesn't say, get rid of them. Now, I believe he does give that permission. I don't want to make anyone who has a right and has exercised that right to feel poorly for exercising that right. But I do want to suggest that in this and so many other instances, when God gives us an allowance, as Paul says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Doesn't mean that's the best way. And so we want to find not just the permitted way forward, we want to find the best way forward. And part of that is understanding what direction God's coming from. Is he saying, go do this? I want to make sure you do this. Or is he pulling you back and saying, don't go any farther than this? And if he's pulling you back, then don't go right up to the brink. Now, if he's pushing you, you just run as far as you want. And so we got to figure out which direction God is coming from in whatever he's saying to us. Well, those are some thought processes about the way God instructs us, about thinking more deeply about those things, thinking about how God is approaching a particular subject. We could talk about that much longer if we had time our time is really already up. But I'll blame Philip for giving me more than the allotted time. We're going to go just a little bit longer here, if you'll bear with me. I got one more point to make, and I think it's the most important. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 25, Abraham asks a question. You remember the occasion where the angels had come and they told him that they're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" Now there's a sort of question, sort of statement there. I think Abraham believes that certainly God will do right, but at the same time he's not absolutely certain that God will do right. And so he wants to make extra sure. Incidentally, the longer he goes, the more sure he gets. And he finds out, no, God wouldn't do that in this particular instance especially. And in fact, what Moses is thinking is what I think a lot of people today think is, surely there were a lot of good people in there, and God says, not so. And the number gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and Abraham can never get low enough to finally find God saying, oh yeah, there's that many. And so he comes to recognize that God is just and he is right in what he's about to do. And I think that about the destruction of the various peoples throughout the Old Testament, when people go, here is genocide and here is slaughter, and it's the same sort of people who are always running around with their hair on fire talking about they wish justice would be brought down, they wish justice would be done, and then they look at a picture of it in God's Word and they go, oh, how horrible. And they're a lot worse than Habakkuk about that, because at least he respected the Lord. Habakkuk wanted God to bring down judgment on the people, and when God told him what it looked like, Habakkuk said, whoa, maybe not. And I think a lot of people need to think about that today. The first thing that we need to recognize is who God is and who we are. The Bible opens up with the words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I think the reason for that is because it sets the tone for everything else. If we recognize that he's the creator, we understand what our positions are. We understand that we are like Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 5, when he stands before the Lord and he trembles and he falls and he says, woe is me, I am ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And what he sees, he cannot stand in his position. That's really the picture every time. Ezekiel falls down almost a dozen times. Every time he sees the glory of the Lord, he falls on his face and has to be picked back up. So I think that we need to understand that position, and we need to therefore say he is the measuring stick. He's the creator. We don't come to God's word. People, when I have conversations with people about the Bible, it feels like, it doesn't just feel like, I know what they're doing is they're looking and they're seeing if it measures up. And I just want to say to them, I want to shake them and say, measures up to what? What ruler do you think you have? This book is not here for you to figure out if it measures up to you. It's here to figure out if you measure up. It's the ruler. We don't come to judge this. It comes to judge me. And so we just come and say, what do you say? That's all I need to know. Because you're God and I'm not. That's where Job comes to recognize. At the end of the book, after he's had his questions, and let me just tell you, he's got a better case for those questions than anybody that's ever lived. And at the end of the day, the answer is, you're God and I am not. And you're right. And I know it. And I hold on to that, and I think Job rejoices at it in the end. I don't want to ever say about some command God has given, unfortunately, God has said. Because another element there is not just that he's right, but he's told us in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 24, he told his people there, the Lord commanded us, this is Moses speaking of his commands, the Lord has commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is this day. People have set down that standard. They think it's too strict and too oppressive or what have you. And all along, there's been people saying, now hold on, you detach yourself from the anchor and you're not going to like what it looks like. And they were scoffed and mocked at. Oh, you think we're on some sort of slippery slope. There's this guy I like to read from time to time. He'll write an article all along that says, let's check in on the slippery slope. That pitch is getting a little steeper all the time, isn't it? People that were considered kooks for things they were saying would happen even 20 years ago now look like prophets. They weren't prophets. They were just people with some sense who know that if you untie yourself from the dock, you are floating off into the abyss. And we don't have the stick, as I say, to measure. Psalm 135 in verse 15. Psalm of praise near the conclusion says this, the idols of the nations are but silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear, nor is there any breath at all in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them. Yes, everyone who trusts in them. I think that the idea of when we set up idols to worship, that we end up becoming what we worship. We're more interested in talking like, you are what you eat. I think it's a much more important principle. You are what you worship. And so the idea is you go and you make an idol in your own image, and then the idol makes you into its image. And it's an uglier thing than you even imagined. And if you think that's not right, just look around you. It's horrifying. Romans chapter 3 and verse 4. People will say to us, you believe that? Nobody believes that. Romans chapter 3 and in verse 4, Paul writes, may it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. When somebody says, nobody believes that, and you're standing on the words of God, you say, well, number one, God does. I do. And incidentally, I think one of the great benefits of us joining together is you can say, I go to a crowded room at least a few times a week where there's a whole bunch of other people that do. But if none of us did, it'd still be true. That's what Paul says. Well, we need that verse right now. Let every man be a liar. Because the whole world's telling us that nobody believes the things we do anymore. Don't buy that, first of all. But even if you did, that'd be all right. Because he's right. And we don't have anything to say against it. What we need is a dose of what Jesus gave to Satan in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4. You know there where Jesus had been fasting for 40 days. And here he has come hungry and weak into the wilderness. And the tempter, it says, came to him and he said, if you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. But he answered and said to him, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Can you imagine? Jesus, if you hold to that, you're going to starve to death. That'll be just fine. See, that's what people tell us. You hold on to that, you're going to lose everything. I won't lose a thing that matters. A lot lock me up, take away my life. What's the worst they could do to you? Shoot you in the head? Paul says in Romans chapter 8, victory. That's all they can do to you, is hasten you there. You can't do anything to the person who lives by God's words that way. And so, people talk about culture wars. We're in a war that's much bigger than culture. We're in spiritual battles, eternal battles. We are at war, and we have been for a long time. People are just now kind of cluing in on that. And so, yes, we're in a war. And guess what we've got? The words of the one who created the world. Yeah, we'll win. If we stick by that, we will win. But if we start wondering what other moralities are out there, then we're giving up the only thing that gives us life in the midst of that. It is not, and I think a lot of good people have done that. They've surrendered and they've ceded ground, and then they've wondered, when it gets so far out of hand, now they want to lasso it back and pull it back over this way. But guess what? They gave up their only thing that could lasso it. And it's not just a shame that we have let men and women, maybe of various pedigree and education, shake our confidence in the rightness of God's word. The greater shame is that we have let some of the most debased scoundrels, perverts, and charlatans of all of history come up and question us about what's right and wrong. I'm not sure about your morality. You're telling me you're not sure about my morality? Have you read your stuff? You don't have a leg to stand on. And the further we get along, the more obvious that gets. The God who created and sustains all the world, the one that is, whose power is sustaining your very breath at this moment, has on a few occasions in history condescended to speak to man and make himself known to us. And this book is the only record of that interaction. It's all we got. I don't want to see one word of this. Not one word. And when somebody opens it up to some passage they think I'm going to find embarrassing and say, you believe that? I want to tell you what, if it's in here, I don't just believe it. I want to set it to music and sing it. All of it. Because it's the words, it's the only words that have any substance to them. Any other words that we find somewhere else written that have substance, they only have substance if they're founded in here. Everything else is chaff that will be burned up. If you do see this, and you find that you are floating off into the abyss, one thing is certain. You will find, everyone who gives up God's morality will find the words of Galatians 6 and verse 7 to be true. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. The world is telling you the same thing Satan's been telling us from the very get-go. It won't happen like God says. And God says, I am no fool, it will. And whatever seeds you're putting in the ground, I guarantee you that's what you will harvest. Where are you getting your seeds from? There's only one place I want to get them from. I hope that those thoughts are helpful. We need courage. The battle's not getting easier. And our kids need courage. And they sure don't need the weak-spined responses that so much of the religious world is giving here, conceding ground all the way. But if you're here this evening, maybe you're someone who's here and you have a general agreement with the morality of the Bible. And I think we have a lot of people in society who feel that way. They have a general agreement. God does not accept general agreement. Total submission. So if you're here this evening, don't dip your toes in. You come and you bow down before the great I am. And you give your life to him. And he will give you everything. If there's anyone who needs to respond to that invitation, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?